All right, and welcome to Better Understanding the Bible. I'm your host, Dallas, and we're joined again with Mercy as we continue our chats into origins. Thanks again for joining us, Mercy. I know you enjoy this as much as I do, and it's not really that much of a labor, but it's fun that you're here. So thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's great.
So I'm going to be cheating. I got some notes for this one. We're as prepared as we've ever been for this conversation. But this is a fun one as we've kind of already dealt into some really big topics. We brought the context of what the Bible is. It was a covenantal retelling. So we have Moses talking about how Israel was created as a nation and the retelling of the history of where they came from. So the covenant created with Adam made its way down the line through Noah to Shem, through Abraham, which promised then became the people of Israel and they were created. So Moses created this covenant language that described these happenings, and it was all recorded within the 5 books of the Torah. Now, there's many debates about who wrote the Bible and wrote the Torah and all this kind of stuff. What we're doing for the sake of this conversation is Deuteronomy specifically said Moses wrote it. So we're going with the narrative of the Bible. And within that, we also then talked about, well, since he wrote this contract and he put the words describing the covenant treaty language that I set before you life and death, blessing and curse, he put that right over Adam so that we would have no mistaking that the both people were entering into the same contract, same agreements. Then we talked about sin previously, talking about that's transgression of that suzerain treaty. So we have Moses talking about how God created a covenant treaty with Israel, that was inherited all the way back to Adam, and that by breaking this, by having transgression against this, that they would either get some kind of punishment, they'd fall under some kind of curse, or they would receive some kind of blessing for being obedient. And so this is just the general kind of history of the conversations we've been having. And this is important for the one we're going to have today as we're moving now. We've kind of talked about the parties are in covenant, they have stipulations to live by. And now that obviously then says, well, what about when those stipulations are crossed? What does judgment look like? Which then instantly brings up the conversation of, well, what is salvation? And that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about judgment and salvation of the covenant treaty, its transgressions, what it looks like, how it's played out, who was saved, why they were saved, what's the context of being saved. It's a small topic, not really interesting to anybody. Salvation, just one of those small, non-interesting ones. So I'm pretty sure this one we're within the about hour we shoot for. We're going to go through very general, big terms. If you haven't, we're going to come into conversations. I've already gone over in great detail in the videos that we've had previously, where I've gone through the workings on the book that I was starting with the verse by verse, specifically history stuff. Get into that because I'm going to assume at this point you've watched some of my previous videos and we're going to make reference to some of that data. So I'm just going to remind you, go back, check that stuff out. If you don't understand what I'm relating to in this conversation, which is quite possible, it's all there. I'm not speaking brand new stuff, just not making this up. It's all been substantiated in those videos, and we just don't want to waste the time in this conversation to hash that all back up. Alrighty, so let's moving on. We're looking at judgment and salvation. So what's interesting is when we hear the words judgment and salvation, I personally, if I were to just go when I was, all churchy and doing trying to live that kind of idea, judgment always had to do with the future, and salvation always had to do with whether or not I get to go to heaven. So this conversation, we're going to steer away from our Greek common, modern ways of reading things, and we're going to try to kind of step that back. But I would be hard pressed to see Mercy. You probably haven't like in the church days. That culture specifically, still to this day, that's pretty normal, right? That's judgment. Like you never talked about Israel judgments much, did you guys?
No, it was never contextualized to what the biblical text actually said, which is the number one rule for exegesis, right? So, in church life, it was always eisegesis. We always read ourselves into it, and really, the foundation of Christianity was this number one thing: you have to be saved to get to heaven, and because you don't want to be judged and go to hell. That's the number one foundation for, I think, a lot of people why they come into the faith of Christianity, right? it's that one thing. So salvation is a huge concept. It's why we do what we do in the religion of Christianity. And so it was never put in context of, okay, well, what does the New Testament say salvation is? You know, it's used 40 times in the New Testament. In the Old Testament, it's used like probably 130 times. But we've never, it was never even in our thinking of trying to unpack that, which was a huge big mistake, because we're really missing the real context of what this word means. And it's a legal word. We might think it's a Christian word because we, you know, the says Jesus says, we say that all the time, but it's really a legal word. It's a covenantal term, and hopefully we can unpack that today.
Well, the thing too with salvation, it rings a very personal tone because it's like I said, if the foundation is we're looking at and you agreed, well, my getting into heaven, well, it's very personal now. It's a very traumatic too because like we're talking about eternity. So if in my head I'm trying to find out, am I going to spend eternity with God? Or if, depending on your view of what the judgment afterlife scenario of either futurism, partial preterism looks like, there's still this, oh, well, I don't know what's going to happen to me. So there's a fear connected to that. There's also just a general fear of what if I miss out? Because I know even from you drop dead and you don't exist anymore, there's kind of even a fear attached to the, you know, there's good sides to the I won't exist anymore, but then there's the wait a minute, I'm not going to exist anymore. So there's realities to these ideas and concepts. It's not just doctrines. And so when people are taking a look at the Bible today, they are interested in, well, what about me? Am I going to go to heaven? Am I going to go to hell? How does all that stuff work out? So when we're taking a look at applying this to the Bible, judgment and salvation, why did judgment take place? Why did salvation need to take place? So, talking about the suzerain vassal treaties, like Mercy was bringing up, it's highly connected. Why? Well, what was the judgment? Well, the judgment was agreed upon at the terms of the agreement, which was in Exodus 19, 7 through 5, or 5 through 7. I set before, or not I set before you, rather, but if you follow these terms, and what was the terms? To be faithful and obedient, then you will be to be a kingdom of priests, a holy priesthood nation. And so when we take a look at that, they had to live up to certain terms. Well, those terms had to be determined whether or not they were living up to them. They had to be judged whether or not they were adhering. So that's when we get into the scenario. What is the judgment side? And I know this isn't big, like this is it's not a hard concept to get. They made an agreement. Two people agreed. A is going to happen, and these things are going to happen. B is going to happen, and these things are going to happen. And when they transgress those things and they enter into the punishment side, that's the judgment coming. Hey, you guys did it. Sorry, you transgressed. You're on the punishment side. That's the judge. So the judgment comes upon the transgressors. In fact, the judgment can't go upon anybody else because what right does someone have to judge anybody who hasn't transgressed them? That then would make them, evil. That would make them imposing their will upon other people. They would become the marauder. So we can't have God just walking around flippantly judging people by his will for no purpose. No, he can't just and this is based upon the morality question. What morality? Yes, I know we can't question God and his ways, all that kind of idea, that theology, philosophy, but we are related.
Oh no. Hello, hello. You got cut off. Oh no. Should I stay on? Let me see.
All right, that was
Okay.
a fun dropout. Everything, we good?
I
Oh,
re- and I was recording, but you were off. We
okay, part of the internet there, eh? But as I was saying, simply put, we have a judgment scenario tied basically into the conditions of the suzerain vassal treaty itself. So we don't have to get all worked up. This isn't a hard concept to make. I make an agreement, you make an agreement. We have to judge whether or not the agreement's upheld. So judgment is fundamentally just part of any type of contract. It's just simply what it is. judged to be determined positive on the good blessing side or negative on the curse side.
Hmm.
Which then brings to us the need for salvation. Well, it's very interesting because what is salvation? Well, there's so many terms we want to throw around. Well, in order to determine what salvation is going to be, we're going to have to look at it from a biblical point of view. And so, what we're going to do is pick up on a fun term that everybody loves, uses, but it seems to be they rarely apply it, and that's going to be type. So, we've heard type often in literature. One of the most famous usages of this word in the Bible is in Romans 5 with Paul when he says, Adam is a type of him who was to come. So now Mercy is an actual educated teacher, like with training for this. So I'm going to hand you the balls here. And would you explain what type means in literature? Because it is obviously quite a big deal. If Paul is saying Adam was a type and Jesus was the, made in that same image to follow that type.
Hmm. So the word type, you can sort of go towards it for archetype, but it's talking about the first form or a pattern that everything else is patterned after, right? And so everything that's patterned after would be like a shadow, a foreshadowing, right? And so in the Bible, what we as theologians would see is, oh my gosh, we see a pattern here. Does this pattern have any rhyme or reason? So when we're looking specifically at the Suzerain Vassal Treaty, it was conditional. The covenant was conditional. So what are the conditions of this? Well, now there is a type or a pattern of how you will be judged. You just mentioned Exodus 19, but if you read Deuteronomy 28, it gives you all of the conditions of the judgment. So when you look at that, you will see, oh my gosh, so this is how they're being judged. In one way, you'll see a type where they're being cast out. That's why Israel was cast out of the land of Israel, right? Others where they are actually, judged through a war. So there's many different types. And so when we study that type or typology in the Bible, that's where theologians are getting these doctrines. Is they're just not making things up out of their head, but they're actually looking into the text and saying, okay, well, where is the first basis? Where is the archetype? Let's study the patterns. And oh, is there a pattern? Let's study that. Okay, now there is a judgment cycle, what I call a covenant cycle system. There is a judgment, or you might say, Dallas, you taught me this, where the light comes out of the darkness. The light comes out of the darkness. And there's two things going on at the same time where people are getting raised out of that darkness. And then those that choose, because it's conditional, if you choose to remain in that darkness, then you will be judged, because the Suzerain Vassal Treaty was a conditional agreement that you have broken. And if you break that, here are the consequences.
And what we're planning on doing in this conversation is to kind of unpack what Mercy was saying there with a bunch of examples, because we definitely see the spread consistently from Genesis all the way through Revelation, specifically with these head people. So these aren't like tiny little hidden things that jump out. These are huge, giant repeating patterns. So much so that what do we hear out of Jesus talking about his return? So shall be, the coming of the Son of Man, so shall be like the days of Moses. So even paraphrasing that,
The days of Noah. You said days of Moses.
oh, sorry,
Yeah.
yeah. So yeah, the days of the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. Well, we get that pattern. Paul's talking about Adam was a pattern for Jesus. We're seeing that the judgment pattern will be just like Noah. So we're seeing these references. And the question then we have to ask is, well, where are these patterns played out? How can we learn about these patterns so that when we're reading this, we'll know why they're being referenced? And
Mhm.
so we want to plug in those basic why this is happening. Like, why is there a judgment? Why is there a war? Why is there these things going on?
Why is there
Well,
a flood? Why are all of these things happening? And in church life, and even in Bible school, you're not taught these types, which you would think that they would really focus on, but it's not focused on. And just watching all your videos, just to the audience, if you haven't watched his previous videos, you really need to, because he really goes through the typology of the Bible, and really it's a framework of the Bible. And if you can grasp that, then it's like you get the skeleton, and when you look at the skeleton, you can look at it and say, oh, that's a raccoon. Oh my gosh, no, that's a reptile. Oh no, that's a monkey. Like, what you're going into. I think for too long, people have not established that, and so people are just like trying to wing it as they go. But when you study the typology, it's right there in the text itself, and it speaks to you.
And it's not a foreign concept that we need these types, because if we just take a look at our culture today, we don't say certain things in certain sections of the city because it's not the right place to say that, where somewhere else in another section, it's totally normal. You wouldn't even think twice about it. But it's just because of the people that's around. It's how, and this is how we say, right? That's how they will take it. Or we might have family members, that's how they'll take it, right? But it's because of that that we need to know how to take it. How do they mean it? So how are we going to take it? We only can do that is to build up those examples. And so that's just types, right? So when we go into this, we're going to take a look at as much as we can right from the beginning, because this is where we're claiming pretty big claims here, but I think it's easily proven that Adam's under the exact same situation that Israel is. Well, then we take a look into Genesis 3. Now, everybody watching, I think, is going to be generally associated with these texts. So if you're not, you're going to have to read them on your own. We're just going to make references to these. So when we're going into it in Genesis 3, we have the situation where Adam and Eve are in complete control. Everything is set up and functioning properly. We know this because the very verse before this was, now they were naked and unashamed. The system was up. There was no sin. But what happens when they do break that agreement? Shame enters, sin enters, the blemish enters, and they have to cover themselves up. We're all familiar with this general story. But what's interesting is if we look at it through that suzerain vassal treaty, how these actions now actually make sense. So we've pictured Adam and Eve, everything's functioning properly, no blemish. Then they're tempted to go and break the covenant. Well, that's exactly what they ended up doing. So they ended up falling for the temptation. Then God arrives on the scene and says, what have you done? Have you broken the covenant agreement? And Adam says, yeah, I did. I broke it. And then what happens? God says, cursed are you. Well, that's exactly what we find out is the suzerain vassal treaty system. Literally. That's
Mhm.
exactly what is made to determine. It doesn't actually go outside of the reason and purpose for there even being this writing outside of a suzerain vassal treaty, because this is what it's telling us the story of. Adam and Eve joined with God under covenant, breaking that covenant, God coming and judging them and determining that they have broken that covenant, and thus rendering upon them the appropriate curses. So now we see the judgment, which was what? The same thing that we read in Deuteronomy, and uh, God picks them up and kicks them off the land. They're removed from their position, they're removed from their authority, they're removed from the garden. They are now no longer in that position of the blessing, where the land that they were in was fruitful, where they were getting all of God's providence given to them while they were in that covenant garden. They were now removed from that. So they were in the blessing side of the covenant agreement. They were in the life tree, and now they have moved over to the curse. So this is a self-contained event at this time period. This is Adam's kingdom, at what Adam is doing, and the people that are under his authority. Remember in Genesis 1, he was given authority over the whole land, over everything that creeps and crawls across the earth.
Mhm.
Adam's got authority over everything, and now he's kicked out of his ruling position. Why? Because of covenant disobedience. So before we go any further, would you say that that would be hard for people to hear? Does that make sense when we see it through the suzerain vassal treaty from a Christian point of view?
Um, No, but it is helpful if you do read some of the Susan Vassar treaties because the language is exactly the same, the type is exactly the same. And when you're talking about, okay, so Adam, failed, he broke the covenant, the agreement, the conditions, and now he's under curse. Those curses are just the conditions in which now he's going to have to live in it, right? That's really basically what's happening. And in throughout, when you say throughout the land, it's the land of Mesopotamia. This is a local story. It's a Semite story. And we got to understand that context.
And when we're talking about Adam, we're talking about Adam and his people, right? Because like in Genesis 5, it's talking about his descendants. Well,
Hmm.
that's how Genesis 2 starts as well. This is the story in Genesis 2:4. In the beginning of the heavens and the descendants. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth. And in Genesis 5, these are the descendants, the generations of Adam. So these are Adam's children that are now filling the land. We have Adam filling the land. That's very, very, very comfortable to us if we put that language over Noah. And so we can easily, comfortably import that view of understanding that here comes Noah after a flood. The land's been decimated and they refill the land. Well, we have no problem seeing that. It's the same thing here with Adam. Adam starts at Genesis 1 with a destruction in the land. The earth was unformed and void. There was darkness on the face of the deep. And we saw a great destruction motif there as well. And we also see a beginning there as well with Noah after a flood scenario judgment, which was extremely common. And I've gone over many times in previous videos how the waters and the flood waters are used as normal symbols of destruction and judgment for disobedient suzerain vassal treaty transgression. And that's exactly what we see coming upon Adam now, is because of what they did and his children following in his footsteps led them to an ultimate place where the sons of God married into the sons of men. The system and the order broke down, polygamy entered, murder entered, the whole land was corrupted. And so here we have Adam being put over in charge of a land with dominion, but unfortunately he broke covenant. He went and did what he was told, commanded not to do. And as a result, he lost control of the land. The land went corrupt, and God came in Genesis 6 with judgment. So that brings in for us, when we get to Genesis 6, a reason for judgment. And we don't have to get into aliens or giants and all this. We don't have to worry about that because the context is established for us that in Genesis 3, the covenant people were ruling, they had power and dominion. Genesis 4, the covenant people fell. They continued the fall from Genesis 3 into Genesis 6 when the whole land became polluted by their fall. And God came in judgment, saying, your transgressions have been added up against you, and the time for your end is upon you. Now, of course, I'm just paraphrasing that, but we all know that scenario. Now, let's take that same exact scenario and put that over Israel. Would you say that that scenario, that basic scenario, you're given dominion, you're given covenant, you break that covenant, now judgment's coming for you? Would you say that that also is a type that we see duplicated over Israel?
Yeah, we see that through the book of Exodus. Moses defines that in chapter 19, and then it's reiterated again in Deuteronomy 28. And in the suzerain vassal treaty, a suzerain and a vassal, they have a territory. So it can't be the whole world. You are only in jurisdiction over the territory that you are in. So I think this also helps. I know it helped me to focus on, okay, where are we starting in Genesis and connecting it to that vassal, suzerain vassal treaty. It is with a territory. It is with a certain people. It is with a certain law. It's all self-contained in that kind of package. So that package is now given to Moses to create Israel. And from that moment on to Joshua and onward, that's what we are reading over and over and over in that whole history of how they're going through the judgment cycles.
Absolutely. When we're reading about Adam, we're talking about a contained event that started with Adam. And then in Genesis 6, we see as the judgment of Adam's choices all culminating up into one scenario. So
Mhm.
we're not talking about human history and all the humans being thrown into some kind of weird scenario in which now mankind has fallen, which we need saved from. We're watching the beginning. So we have Moses watching the beginning of Israel being created, God making a covenant with them, and Moses is claiming this is the covenant that was inherited from Adam, the first Mesopotamian or most prominent, obviously something of spectacular notoriety, that
Absolutely.
Moses is claiming that they got their covenant entrance by that Adam.
Mhm. At the
So
beginning of human civilization, as people now, the human consciousness is now evolving and getting bigger to the city states and kingdoms and empires. This is a whole era of empire building. Oh my gosh, this is kingdom come. Kingdom, it shall be done according to you. This is a prayer of Jesus. So when Jesus comes, he's talking the same language of this kingdom language. But that kingdom language is going to come to an end. That kingdom time is going to come to an end, and you'll talk about that. But here we have this kingdom, and this is continuing, but it's that self-contained event for Adam. And when Adam is judged, you have 10 generations before he's actually judged, while at the same time in that darkness, Noah is being taken out of that darkness, and Noah is like the new savior, right? So then here we have another whole cycle.
which brings us to the next part of this conversation, which is salvation. So, what is salvation then, which is very interesting? Turns out it's the mercy of God being poured out upon the people he's judging. So, it's a very interesting scenario because in this agreement, God rightfully has permission, according to the law. So, this is a legal action to come in and destroy the people. He's doing exactly what they agreed to. He's not doing anything immoral, illegal, dysfunctional. He's not, his emotions aren't involved. This is a straightforward legal requirement. You were driving your car. You went over the speed limit. You got a ticket. They made an agreement with God. They broke that agreement. They're getting punished. There's no feelings, emotions. That's all this is. So when Adam failed to live up to that agreement, God brought the judgment. But now here's what's neat, which we can read in Romans. Paul talks about this, that now the character of God is revealed apart from the law. So who God is in his character, the buildup and the makeup of the being of who God is to show mercy even to those who are legally subjected to destruction. So God's character, apart from this suzerain vassal covenant agreement, said, I'm not going to wipe you all out. I can't do that. It's not within me to do. So
Right.
God's mercy, go ahead.
Look at Adam to Noah, you're talking about 10 generations, and you know whether the age of how long they lived is real or not, 930 years, that type of thing. I don't know about you, but 10 generations of people to finally judge, that's very merciful. We need to flip that around, because I think people that don't have that background just read and think, oh my gosh, this is horrible, God is just horrible, he's wrathful, he's judging these people. But no, when you actually look at how patient and long suffering he was, that he's waiting 10 generations, now Noah's coming, and now he's finally going to judge with a warning, by the way. And people still had a choice. That was what we talked about in the last video. The tree was the choice. Hey, do you want to come into life, into blessing, or you want to come into death, into curse? That was a choice that was given to all. And so in that whole context, I just see God's mercy over and over again. I see it all over.
And we do see that straight out in scripture too, right? Like it's God's heart to show mercy to the judged. So those who are beat down and trodden by the evil leaders that lead the children astray, God still pours out upon those who are lost within that war. So we do see it being a kingdom structure where the head's results cause that destruction over, and God reaching in saying, the judgment's against Adam and Adam breaking the covenant, but there were people in the midst of his kingdom which I'm going to save and pull out. So what's interesting there is we then start to see this type where judgment is created at the transgression of the covenant people, and destruction comes to remove that people, while simultaneously God is pulling a people out of those people and ends up starting a new kingdom or a new people with them. We actually, if we want to look at this, because we're very familiar with this in the Noah sense, because obviously Noah became the savior type, and we see he gets the uh, group of in that scenario, the animals are brought to him, put on the ark, and they're saved from the flood scenario. So they're saved from judgment. That's a remnant. So
Hmm.
here we have a judgment, a salvation, and that salvation brought a remnant out.
Hmm.
If we want to look at this, this actually isn't the first place in the Bible where this happens. So Mercy accurately brought up the light will shine out of the darkness comment, because the first place we see this happen is in Genesis 1, day 1,
Hmm.
where we see, and the earth was formless and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. Well, we know the deep is a reference to the floodwaters. Even just in Genesis 7, God opens the doors of the deep and floods the system. Genesis 8 is the deep which is closed when the rain stops. So the deep is part of this flood system. And in Genesis 1, we have the flood system over top of the earth. So the earth has just been flooded. And here we have God pulling a light out of that darkness. And that light became Adam. Adam was pulled out of that darkness and he built a kingdom out of him. Now, here we have that exact same scenario going on with Adam, where Adam breaks covenant, their kingdom goes dark. God brings a covenant judgment of a flood upon them. And out of that darkness, God pulls a light named Noah and starts a new kingdom with him in the exact same manner. Now, we read in Genesis 9, and Noah became a man of the soil and built a vineyard. Then what? The covenant is renewed with him and his children who fill all of that same land.
Hmm.
So we see the perfect type already duplicated. At the start of Adam, he was born from a flood, and the end of Adam was it was a flood. But that's all self-contained. That was one kingdom. That was one manifestation of the covenant kingdom event.
Hmm.
And when it failed, it wasn't all of humanity, it was just his kingdom and area. Then that covenant right to rule over the land, Genesis day 6, and God gave man dominion. Well, that's what we see happen to Noah in Genesis 9. And he gives him authority over all the animals of the earth. He makes him follow in the image of Adam, in the image of God, in the likeness. And then what happens? He has children, and God makes his covenant with them and Noah. And it's from them then that we see comes the promise to Abraham, to where we find the beginning of Israel. And we find a very interesting scenario with Israel. Here we have Egypt, who has fallen into darkness. And God is judging them with plague after plague, bringing destruction to their armies, laying waste their population with plagues, laying waste to their livestock, destroying their culture, their crops, everything. And out of that darkness, God pulls a brand new people, Moses, and he goes and builds a kingdom with them. So I see this type happening. So we have Moses, one author, who tells this type that Adam was built in a flood scenario judgment, which God pulled him out as a remnant. Then God judged him and destroyed him and pulled Noah out as a remnant. Then and then out of that remnant of Noah came Israel, and God destroyed Egypt and pulled Israel out from Egypt and turned them into a covenant nation.
Hmm.
So, without going further and deeper, we already have by one author who's substantiating how Israel became a covenant nation, suggesting that salvation and judgment are they're uniquely tied together. Salvation is talking about coming out of the judgment of another nation and being brought into the beginning of a new nation.
Hmm.
The old nation was rejected and the new nation is accepted. So what we're
I,
seeing with go ahead, sorry.
I call it the double double. You will that mercy thing. Um, but we see this duplication in, like, okay, so from Adam to Noah, where it was 10 generations. Egyptians during the time of Egypt and Moses, you see the 10 plagues, right? You see this kind of motif going on. And since the beginning in Genesis, they're using the ancient world, used creation as a huge motif because everybody can relate to it. That was what they saw as life and death. If you couldn't survive the weather, or you didn't have enough food, it was life or death. And so
And
there's
even more than just culture, they saw it as God create. This is God's creation. This is how God sees everything should be built. This is his natural tabernacle, the heavens above, the earth below, and the sea to the east. This is the way the world was to them when they
yeah,
looked at the world. So to them, there was no, like, when they looked up, there was no I wonder. There was, that's God,
yeah,
and that's where he lives, and we live down here. So there was no, well, there was no contemplating that stuff.
yeah.
That was just the way it was.
Yeah, it was a given. That was their cosmology. And when you look at the Hebrew words for garden, yes, it's in this creation motif, but that word garden, and you mentioned about Noah cultivating the soil. Adam was called to cultivate the soil. Dr. John Walton talks about this as well. But there's these words in Hebrew where it talks about the cultivation of the soil, but to serve, to work the soil. And it's actually a terminology that's used in temple worship for the priesthood. So people don't understand that when you're just reading Genesis as a face value, you're just reading garden. You're like, okay, I don't know. Well, the garden was a huge temple motif. The garden was the temple where God resided, right? And when you're talking about somebody that he calls out to work the soil, it was actually a priesthood that he was calling. So by the time Moses comes, they're all very familiar with this. And what does Moses say in chapter 19:6? You are a holy nation, a kingdom of priests. He's doing the exact same thing. See, we're just not trained to see it, but you're seeing that motif of the garden, its temple. You're seeing the cultivation of the soil, it's a priesthood. Moses comes now, he's trying to legitimize Israel. He's doing the same thing there to establish that. How do you do that in the midst of civilization and kingdoms? You have to have laws. You can't have lawlessness. You have to have order and function. This is a Hebraic way of how to do life. God has order and function in the world. You have the snow and the rain and the seasons and the sun and the moon, and everything's working in order. This is what you want to live by. So we
And they're
see
not, they're not
it over.
evil, and they're not bad. Like,
No.
that's like the rain coming and the snow. It's not evil. That's not bad. This God doing what God's doing. So they
Yeah.
have to adjust. And it's like, why the soil? Why is the soil such a big deal?
Mhm.
Adam means the earth. It means the soil. Adam is tilling the ground. He's a worker of the soil. Adam is supposed to work the people. He's supposed to be the head over and lead the people.
Mhm.
He's the tiller of the ground. Noah was a tiller of the soil. Adam's firstborn, Cain, was a tiller of the soil. It was their job. They were given a purpose, as Mercy's pointing out. And these are all in line with that covenantal responsibility as head over these people. You were talking about so many cool things. I had to throw that one thing in there. Sorry to derail you, but I had to throw that in.
Yeah, no, those are important points, that we have to draw out for people because, we don't have the ancient Near Eastern text in our heads. We don't know the cosmology of this ancient book that's, 2000, 4,000 years old. And when you begin to unpack that, it makes so much better sense.
Well, we see that with Jesus now coming on the scene too, because he ends up picking up this exact same motif too, right? Because like all of a sudden that same language, new creation starts coming in, new heaven, new earth. All of a sudden, he's created us in him. What do we see in Colossians? You've rescued us from darkness, brought us into the domain, you've rescued us from the domain of darkness, brought us into the inheritance of light. So all this starts happening again, the same, but we also have a new covenant happening at the exact same time. Why? Because Israel has transgressed. So not only do we have that same motif we see of the flood coming, so we have that flood judgment of Adam, a flood judgment removes Adam. remnant comes out. Salvation, physically removing them from physical danger. Okay, so salvation isn't a mystical, magical thing. Hey, we're not talking about going to heaven.
Was
What has
not
happened?
was not spiritual. It was a covenantal shift in position that the suzerain had a responsibility towards, that they must receive in a physical manner. That's what they're thinking. We need to be saved in this fashion as a nation, as a group, as a people of the land, the dirt. We have to survive, salvation, rescue, that kind of thing.
So not only do they have the natural, which is the, oh my God, please don't flood us, they have the spiritual of, oh God, please don't wipe us away as a people that's true to you. So there's those people amongst them that are true believers and those who aren't. So that sets up judgment and salvation in that process, right? So Adam was saved out of darkness. Noah is saved out of darkness. And now we get this picture of Jesus coming to save Israel out of darkness.
Mm.
And so we're seeing that same thing over and over again. But in Adam, the type, as Paul calls him, it's independent. It's not about anybody else. So when we're talking about Adam and the plains of Shinar, where Noah repopulates, those people had a start and an end. And when they ended, Noah had a new start, and a new end for them came when the Tower of Babel confusion happened. So we have,
Let me inject this. It really helped me when you use the word like the kingdom of Adam or the kingdom of Eden was judged. Out of that came Noah, but Noah's kingdom was judged, in Babylon with the Tower of Babel. So that kingdom was judged. And out of that came who? Abraham. Abraham is now coming out of that. He is now the remnant seed. And then from that, we go all the way to Moses, right? So then that kingdom was judged. Egypt was judged because Joseph was in Egypt. And now they're pulling them out of Egypt. Now they're going to go into Canaan land, right? So you're seeing like each kingdom is being judged for what it's done, what for its own thing that it had, being penalized.
yeah, it's a subsequent trail. And this is why the genealogies are so important in the Bible. Why does Luke travel his genealogy so that it duplicates literally the Genesis 5 genealogy? Why does Moses include that Genesis 5 genealogy? Why are suzerain vassal treaties common to have a genealogy back to the original covenant member? Why? So you know what you're inheriting. And that's a big deal because the covenant can only pass from king to son. You have to be in the bloodline. You have to be in that one line. This is for one special people. This is the claim of the Bible that God started with Adam. Adam's kingdom went defunct and they got judged for it. Eden came to an end. And that was it. But out of that travesty came a new people under Noah. And they raised up another kingdom and it went defunct. And so that fell. Then out of that group, another light was taken, and that was Abraham, which becomes Israel. Another light that's pulled out of that defunct system. So there's no doubt that what Mercy's tapping on here, this is the repetition, because now we get into the New Testament, and that's what we catch up again with Israel, who had their beginning coming out of the darkness of Egypt. Well, now they've gone defunct.
Mm.
And now Jesus is said,
Yeah, and what's special about Jesus and Jesus's kingdom is that now this is going to be the end. So this is very unique in that
we
context.
might not want to go down that can of worms yet because we're still just trying to figure out salvation here.
Yeah, but that's the uniqueness of it, is that here we go, the last Adam.
And that's very true. And that's something we got to pay attention to because this is not is exactly the same as the rest. And I think that's quite
Mm.
apparent that when we get to Jesus, and that's something we'll definitely get into. But with 15 minutes left, that's the beginning and not the end. But what we do see is when we get into the New Testament, it's the exact same thing, right? We have this body that's broken, which is in darkness, Israel. They're reaching out to this new king of light, Jesus, who's transferring them from a dead, transgressed kingdom, Mercy brought up Daniel 9:11 last time. All of Israel's transgressed the law, and the judgments of those are coming upon us. Daniel 9, they gave him 490 years. Jesus appears about that time later. And what? A new kingdom is formed under him, under a new covenant, transferring people from the defunct system into the new kingdom of light. So we're actually seeing the exact same duplication that we see with Adam. Adam was pulled out of darkness, made the light kingdom. They failed. Now Noah came and pulled out as the new light people. And that's exactly what we started with Jesus saying, so shall be the coming of the Son of Man. It'll be just like the days of Noah. And actually, it's exactly the same as Noah because Daniel ends with their end will be with a flood. That's pretty interesting. We also have what does John write about in the book of Revelation? This big, gigantic lake of lava. So we have this flood and we have this lake of lava that's been just poured over the whole scenario, the lake of fire, however you want to describe it. If we hear about it in Ezekiel, the streams of fire that have been pouring, getting ready for this event. And it's very interesting because we have salvation appearing at this judgment event, exactly the same as we see with Noah. So I think this type is why we need to really focus again on how should we interpret judgment and salvation, but through the eyes of the suzerain vassal treaty and not through that initial how do I assure my way to heaven, because the suzerain vassal treaty system doesn't even pose that question. And when we look at Adam, when we look at Noah, when we look at Israel, and when we look at Jesus, all of them are concerning the suzerain vassal treaty transgressions between them and God, and nothing, absolutely nothing to do with eternal security. So this has nothing to do with those conversations. So if we're going to look at these contexts and then try to apply it to ourselves in a modern time, I don't think we can actually say judgment and salvation is necessarily even talking about us. Because how could it be talking about us when Adam's transgressions that were held against him were the Eden covenant agreements, which was rendered upon them in the flood and fully paid out? We see the exact same scenario throughout Scripture with Noah, all the way to Jesus. Why would it change with Jesus? Adam was a self-contained event. From him came Noah. Noah's Babylon event was self-contained. They had a start and a beginning, a start and an ending, and a remnant was taken out of that. The Israelite started, has a start and an ending, and a remnant was taken out of that. Why is the last one talking about us and all the other ones aren't? So we got to ask ourselves audience relevancy. Adam was talking about Eden. Noah was talking about Babel. Israel was talking about Jerusalem and Israel. Where do we fit in? Do we need to worry about judgment for us? Because if we do, we have to ask what suzerain vassal treaty agreement are we under and how did we transgress it? Two, do we need salvation from that? Because if we're not under it, then we're not going to be judged. We're never going to need to be saved. So it brings up a lot of positional questions if we want to hold on to traditional views. Because there's no doubt that if we are reading it in a contextual, historical sense, and I really lean on historical, because the entire kingdom system of the Middle East was run by these treaty systems. Not all of them were suzerain vassal, but they were all treaties. This is where treaties come from. This is when writing came into existence. This is when kingdoms came into existence. And this is when the treaties to govern the terms between them had to be established and come into existence. This is a big deal. This is a very big deal
Yes,
because
it's collective identity, it's a national concept. If we can really wrap our head around that, it's a national concept, a national judgment, a national salvation, right? Because it's connected to a contract, treaty, covenant. That's why you teach a lot about covenant language. That's what you're referring to. So when you see that in the text and in the Bible, then those personal questions um, don't really apply in this context, right? And the words that we use today, are you saved? I was saved, or oh, God's going to judge me, or I sinned. These things, those words do not mean the same as what the Bible means. And I think that's what we're trying to show to the audience, is that distinction, and why is there such a big gap. And that's for another video. But anyways.
But that's the thing too, is we're not taking away salvation because we are saved. There is a thing, but it's not what the Bible's talking about. So if we were to apply that to us today, can I say I've been saved? Absolutely. If you know me from before and what I went through, and I've got on my channel a testimony, you can go and take a look at it. But we need to be saved from a lot of things, but it's not kingdom anymore. The kingdom time was over. That covenant period ended. We live in darkness, apart from God, fearful, unknowing, left to our own wits to determine the things that are about with around us, with no connection to anything, just lost in a sea of nothingness. And there's a promise that God is there. This part of the walk is to shine light on this so that we would know, we would understand. And we are to be brought out of that darkness and be brought into the light of understanding, so that while we're here, while we exist, while we can be so with that peace and that balance. What we need to understand is that's salvation, to be taken from that and be put into that. But this isn't a treaty thing. This isn't an obligation thing. God's doing this just out of his pure, sheer mercy. He just loves. So he's helping people. He's loving people. He's doing what he's always wanted to do, is have a family of people he could love. And how? Not through legal terms. And that's the big deal, is now relationship. Why do you take your son out of the ditch and help him? Because you love him, not because a law told you to. And now, apart from the law, we're free to do the same with God, where before we weren't. And that's the revelation. We all do it. We all do it. We put ourselves and our value, our worth, and our being upon our tasking. And then we present our tasking to the world and say, accept us. Then we can come out of that. That's one stage, one aspect of the darkness that can be changed in our lives. There's millions. We're all in different positions. We're all in different scenarios. We're all blinded to certain things. And that's part of the human experience. We're not given, and I pick on Mercy stuff here, we're not given a supernatural existence. That's not what we're given. We're given a human existence, and we're going to have struggles. We're going to have catastrophe. We're going to live in darkness. And then we're going to be called to the light so that we can be in the light and have that. But it's not a kingdom issue. It's not a sin issue. It's not a displeasing Father issue. It's not a providing reason for God to accept me issue. It's not I've done this or I've believed that. It's God created. There's a scenario we're involved in, and he wants us to be wise to it. And that's the light. It's life. We can live in the darkness and end up with what we end up with, or we can be transitioned and have our consciousness, as the scripture says, renewing of our mind daily. This isn't about whether or not my walls around me are made out of gold, or whether or not the food I plant I can eat. This isn't about that. This is inside my heart. And the message of God has always been for your mind to change, your heart to be circumcised. And that's what the freedom apart from the law gives us. Why would you want to go back under those rules of authority, of submission, that I'm not good enough, that I can only be good enough unless I perform? That's a slave. You want to be a dancing girl to submit to your king? It makes no sense. That's backwards. That's an old world. That's old age. And that's why this is so important for us to transition out of old age mentality. We're not under an old kingdom. We're not under an old ruler. We're not under a bunch of rules that we have to move and dance to. We don't have to please God. He made us pleasing to him.
And
We don't
that's
have to
why
worry about that.
is so beautiful. We actually have a testimony in time with a whole group of people that God had worked through so that we don't have to go through all of that. That's the beauty, that we've been set free from all of that. They had to go through all of that. And it's a testimony to the people in the future. Hey, you're probably going to go through this kind of, coming out of darkness into light. You don't have to go through all of this to learn it. Just learn it through this biblical text, like understand it, and now realize what's already been done for you and live in that realized theology. I call it realized theology, right? It's not future or past anymore. It's just, it's been done. And now you sit in it and you realize it. And I get it. It's very hard for us, especially, I mean, I've been in Christianity forever. And the indoctrination of, oh my gosh, what is required of me? What do I need to do? How do I do? And God's just like, you don't have to do anything. Just realize what I've already done and step in it and live in it. That's very hard for people to do, coming out of religiosity or Christianity or rules or laws. We like those rules and laws. We like it because then it gives us some kind of a format or a formula. But it's not right now. It's not the time of the kingdom. It's the time of the spirit, where we are now set free to realize what's already been done. We don't want to repeat what's in the Bible. That's why the Bible is there, so we can learn from it.
And like Paul said, if righteousness could have come into the world, it would have come through the law. The law
Yeah.
is not bad. It reveals within us that character and that nature. Like John 3 said, judgment has come into the world and men prefer the darkness to the light. We don't want to stand before God fully revealed. We don't want to be Adam and Eve naked before God and just don't obliterate me. We just don't want that. We want to have, here's my list. I know you can now. No, I know where I stand. I'm safe. I'm good. It's all right. I got this proof. But God wants more than that. Could you imagine having a child just so that the moment he became cognizant, you could put a list in front of him and say, now perform this or I'll hate you? It's ridiculous for us at this day and age to think that's how God perceives mankind.
Mhm.
What's scary is there was a time that was normal.
Yeah.
And what we need to realize is the old covenant was given to them to teach them out of it.
Mhm.
So why are we trying to go back under it? That's why they were under the law. They had to. They had no choice.
The
So
tutor. Mhm.
absolutely. So if Adam started under the law, and the whole purpose of this covenant agreement was to, they had that stipulation agreement. That's what led to judgment, which
Mhm.
is what led to the need for salvation. Really get that into your head, people. Salvation didn't exist until the transgression. There was no
Mhm.
need for salvation until the transgression. So God knew beforehand, making this contract, that Adam was not going to be able to live up to it. We also have to accept this. God knew the failings of man and still engaged in this anyway to birth the end. We needed the end, and the end needed a start. And that start was in Adam. And just like Mercy said, the end came, but the message is eternal. We aren't under anything to come to God. Judgment was tied to the law, salvation was tied to the law. That was the old age, that was the old system, and that was put away. This isn't even a fringe conversation which we normally have on this channel. This is a basic gospel doctrine message. Yes, at the time of the end when Jesus arrived, yes, they needed to be saved from physical people coming in and physically cutting their heads off, physically throwing them in jail, physically assaulting them, physically taking their children away. Physically, they had to deal with this. Then we're going to say, I can't go to church on Sunday somehow equates to that.
Mhm.
We got to pull context. The context is those people were a special elected people to survive the judgment of the Suzerain Vassal Treaty judgment of Israel. That's who needed saved.
Mhm.
That's the salvation they were brought into. And there was a greater depth to that, which Mercy alluded to, which was different than Adam, with Jesus being the last Adam. And we need to acknowledge, though, that the fundamentals even of that is coming out of the fact that it was a covenant stipulation system, and that came to an end. We are not in that covenant stipulation system. We never inherited that covenant stipulation system. You never agreed to be under a covenant stipulation system. You're not accountable to any covenant stipulation system. And that's one of these major topics that I'm glad we were able to kind of address here, is because how can I tell you you're not accountable to the covenant of Israel when Jesus arrived if you don't know what the Suzerain Vassal Treaty is, if you don't know what sin is, if you don't know why Moses was talking even about Adam? We've done a really good job of putting ourselves as being the star of the Bible. But when we pull ourselves out and we read it for what they would have seen, we realize they were the ones that had to deal with these issues, not us. We inherit the problem of understanding that what they went through, so we can apply that to our lives and understand what the message was. As Mercy was saying, this wasn't just a time in history. This was God testifying to the world. There's nothing holding you from me. It's the greatest message of all time. And we all sit around wondering if God loves us enough not to throw us into a fiery pit for all eternity, when his one message is, come to me. I have nothing against you.
Mm-hmm.
So hopefully we shed a little bit here on judgment and salvation, Mercy. I know I did a lot of talking in this one, but it's one of those. I'll give you the final word on it. Like, there's just too much we can say, but it's on everybody's mind at one point when they come to any type of spirituality. Is judgment and salvation my issue to deal with?
Mm-hmm. So last word. Do you really want to go through a blood sacrificial system? Do you really want to go through a temple to meet God? Do you really want to go in during these feasts to have some kind of forgiveness from God? You would never want to do that. That system, they had to go through it. I'm glad, we have it recorded there, but thank God we are not a part of that. And so now you might ask, well, what do we do now? Well, what did Jesus say to the Samaritan woman at the well in John 4? Those of you who want to worship me, you worship me in spirit and in truth. It's that simple. You're seeking after God, you're seeking after truth. I'm telling you, he's right there. He's right there. Realize that, and he will begin to show himself to you. It's that simple.
And again, I'm going to pull on this one string again from Mercy. Remember, we're not promised magical lives. We're promised a human experience. Don't expect your house to turn into gold, and don't expect fireworks because you now think a certain way. Be prepared for trauma, sadness, rejection, heartache, and joy, and love, and acceptance, and balance that in your life. And even if you don't hear the doves, you don't go outside and have the baptism of the sun and the doves coming down on you. It doesn't matter. It's God's word, and we can trust it. So I want to thank you very much, Mercy, for popping in on this one. I don't know what we'll have next week. We didn't continue on where I thought we were going to go, but it's definitely a necessary conversation, which I think we'll probably figure out a really neat one for next one. I hope you guys all enjoyed it. Thank you again, Mercy, for joining us for this conversation. And whatever it is next week, I know it'll be somewhat controversial. So wherever you are, I hope this has found you well. God bless.